All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the TASA September webinar series. This will be our last one for the month, but we invite you to participate again in October. My name is Crystal Garcia, and I'm the training coordinator here at TASA. Just a few housekeeping things before Vanessa gets started. As a reminder, this is a webinar that is being recorded. It will be available pending any technical difficulties with the recording on TASA's YouTube channel in about 7 to 10 business days. So we are keeping cameras and microphones muted so that Vanessa can focus on our content today. If you have any questions for her, please feel free to use the Q&A function or the chat function. I'll be monitoring those and kind of jumping in with questions, or if they need to wait to the end, we can do both. So we have quite a few callers on the line today. If you have a question, you can raise your hand. Questions about CEUs or anything else related to TASA webinars can be directed to me. My email address is cgarcia@tasa.org. We're not able to issue credits for our webinars at this time, but we're looking forward to offering those in the future. So it looks like I have 11:04 on my desktop, which is a little bit fast. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Vanessa and get us going with today's webinar.
Wonderful. Hi, everybody. Just before I forget to say it, if anybody has questions at any point, feel free to jump in, drop them in the chat, whatever. I'm happy to take questions throughout. I'm Vanessa. I use she, her pronouns. Let me share my screen with y'all and we can get started. All right. So like I said, my name is Vanessa. I use she, hers pronouns. I'm the Director of Prevention Education at the Family Place in Dallas, Texas. And today we're going to be talking about just all of the little things to know that would make it easier to understand trans youth, to connect with trans youth, to understand the soapboxes and debates that trans youth might have with each other, all of those kinds of little things. So just my experience kind of with this issue, as a grad student getting my Master of Public Health, I did a lot of research, like interviews and focus groups with trans folks doing research just to figure out how to improve medical and mental health care, basically asking people like, what good experiences have you had? What bad experiences have you had to help healthcare providers better provide those services. I was also a long-term volunteer with the ACLU of Texas, working with trans teens in Fort Bend ISD, which is in the Houston area, do some advocacy with their school district around some like transphobic discrimination that was happening in their schools. I'm a long-term volunteer with the Resource Center here in Dallas, which is an LGBTQ kind of community center. I work with the youth program there. I facilitate discussion and support groups, chaperone their field trips, do their social events, and in general provide mentorship for those youth. And as a fun bonus experience, I'm also an agender person. So that's my credentials for this topic. So today we're going to be talking about the trans umbrella. So basically all of the identities that are housed within the term transgender, the difference between gender identity and sexual orientation, and the whole gay alphabet soup. Lots and lots and lots of vocabulary. Just as a heads up, this is going to be real heavy on defining and clarifying and explaining terms. We'll talk about pronouns, transitions, mental health, and then some of the micro or macro aggressions that trans folks will experience in education, counseling, social services, healthcare, all of those kinds of things. And a lot of this is based on my own experiences working with trans youth and the things that they bring up, the issues that they share about things they've experienced receiving services that they don't love. And this is really because when these youth go to seek services a lot of the time, especially from counselors or healthcare providers, they end up spending all of their time providing like a transgender 101 education to that service provider instead of receiving the service that they came for. And that's just super frustrating for the youth. It really takes a toll on them. It doesn't make them have a lot of faith in whatever system they're seeking help from, and it discourages them from coming back. They feel like this person doesn't really know how to work with me, so why bother? So that's why I want to talk about these things today, just to understand those experiences of trans youth a little bit better. My disclaimer is that some of the vocabulary that we're going to talk about is good to know, but you probably shouldn't use it yourself if you're not part of the trans community. Just talking about like certain, terms that maybe have been reclaimed or outdated language. That just shouldn't really be used anymore. So also as kind of a trigger warning, we will use some outdated language just to show what that is and why it shouldn't be used anymore. And I'll also be using just like the names of body parts like penis and vulva and things like that. So general heads up for that if that's a problem for anybody. So we're gonna start with the basics, just some basic vocab, that good trans 101. So transgender is an umbrella term, so it's a catch-all for people whose gender identity doesn't match the sex they were assigned at birth. And we'll define those terms in a second too. But basically, because it's an umbrella term or a catch-all, it means that not every transgender person has the same gender identity or identifies in the same way. So everybody's different, and that's going to be a repeating theme throughout this webinar. You will hear me say 4 million times today, everybody's different, and that's okay. So that's, we'll get into the transgender umbrella more in a bit. Sex assigned at birth, which was part of that transgender definition, is that designation of male or female given to somebody at birth, usually based on your external anatomy. So basically, baby is born and, baby has a penis, so the doctor says it's a boy, right? So that's what sex assigned at birth is. The transgender umbrella is that, all-encompassing label for all of these identities, and they're typically split up into two different camps of binary and non-binary identities. Binary meaning two, meaning either or. It's those identities of male or female, right? One or the other. So a transgender man or a transgender woman, those are binary identities under the transgender umbrella. And non-binary identities are all the folks that say, none of those labels apply to me, or maybe those labels apply to me at different times or in different ways at different times, or sometimes I feel this way and other times I don't, right? It's all of the kind of other category are those non-binary trans identities. And not all non-binary people identify as trans, and that's okay too. I'm one of those people as an agender person. I exist under that non-binary umbrella. And there's all kinds of different reasons that people might be under that umbrella and not really identify themselves as trans. For me, it's just that I almost feel like that'd be taking up space in a place that I don't exactly fit. I don't want to take up that space that belongs to somebody else, but everybody's different. Cisgender is someone who identifies with the sex they were assigned at birth. So baby is born with a vulva, the doctor says it's a girl, and then girl grows up and says, you know what, you're right, I am a girl. So it's just that you fit the narrative that you've been given your whole life. So cis means that you're not trans. It's the easiest way to remember it. I want to talk about intersex identities a little bit, just because these are folks that often get left out of these conversations around gender and gender identity and sex assigned at birth. And some intersex folks consider themselves part of the LGBTQ+ community, some don't. Everybody's different. That's okay. An intersex person might also belong to some other identity within that LGBTQ acronym, so that's great too. But intersex is another umbrella term. It's a catch-all. Not every intersex person shares the same variations or different arrangements of chromosomes and hormones and sex organs and things like that. So we typically think of intersex folks kind of in that like traditional stereotypical way of somebody who has quote unquote both sets of genitals. And that's the traits that we're referring to here in this definition that are visible at birth. But not all of those variations that would make a person intersex are physically apparent at all. Maybe they're visible at birth, maybe not till puberty, and maybe never. Maybe it doesn't fit that traditional narrative that we've been given about intersex bodies. It can just be a different combination of chromosomes or hormones, completely internally, that just doesn't line up with our traditional expected patterns for men and women and those biological signs that we're looking for. So there can be plenty of intersex people that don't even know they're intersex because those variations are 100% internal, and you'd never have any reason to know that. It's fairly common for intersex people not to know they're intersex. Some interesting little tidbits here with intersex folks, people that find out they're intersex later in life. It happens a lot with athletes, like Olympic athletes, professional athletes, people that are involved in a sport kind of as their career, where maybe there's some sort of testing they have to do before they can compete in this, or there's a question about their ability to do this, or have they been using, a certain substance or whatever. And sometimes during that kind of testing, a person finds out that, oh, actually I have these variations. So there's some really interesting case studies out there of Olympic athletes specifically around finding out that they are intersex. And a brief note on here, intersex folks are what historically were called hermaphrodites or hermaphroditic people. That is a super derogatory term that we do not use anymore. If an intersex person chooses that label for themselves, that's great. But if you are not an intersex person, that is not a label that should be used. Also, I think there might have been something in the chat that I didn't see. Oh, there we go. No, not being allowed to complete based on the intersex identity. Yes, yeah, that's a big thing. It's kind of along those lines of the debates that we see with just allowing trans athletes to compete with the gender that they identify with, right? And then somebody's intersex, people get all of these feelings about like, well, you're not a real girl or whatever, so you can't run with the girls because it would be an unfair advantage. So definitely some phobic ideas there that keep people from doing things that they like. The abuse of intersex infants, also super relevant, especially for those of you here who are working in the sexual violence field. For infants whose intersex status is visibly apparent at birth, it's usually treated as a problem that has to be fixed, which means surgically. So this little phallometer here is something that's been used to basically figure out, like, are you normal or are you a problem, right? That's kind of the thinking that gets used with this. So if that little bit of flesh in your genitals full of thousands of hypersensitive nerve endings are under 3/8 of an inch in length, then we call it a clitoris and you're a girl. And if it's over an inch, then we call it a penis and you're a boy. But if you're anywhere between that 3/8 and that 1 inch, then you're unacceptable, right? And that's when we have a surgery, which maybe involves parents just choosing what gender you're going to be, or the doctor choosing what gender you're going to be. It might depend on, are you closer to that 3/8 or closer to that 1 inch, which way you get pushed. But it's this kind of highly invasive surgery that you don't really get a choice in, and it really determines the entire way that you get raised because other people are deciding your gender for you. And to be clear, that variation between 3/8 and 1 inch is not a health risk. It's not a health concern. There's no reason to change it surgically, especially on an unconsenting infant. There's no really good reason. It's just kind of social constructs and what we think is normal. So gender identity versus sexual orientation.
Vanessa, before you go to the next slide, we have a lot of people saying the slides aren't showing up for them, that there's some squares that are blocking content. Do you see that on your screen?
No.
On my screen, they're like gray, like boxes where it looks like.
Let me stop screen sharing and just start it up again and see if that fixes it.
Okay.
Oh, bizarre. Is that better for folks? Do we see it? Are we seeing the slides changing?
The slides are changing. We just have now it's a black box just covering up a part of the slide, and the top corner.
Maybe that's the little Zoom window. Did this fix it?
Mm-mm. That
Okay,
moved it. That moved the box. Yeah.
Okay, that's my little Zoom window of just people's faces. So let me just hide it. Are we good now?
It's smaller.
Oh my goodness. I don't have anything on my screen. I guess if there's something that gets blocked, like
Is it the
text-wise.
chat box by any chance?
No, I don't have any of that open. It's all closed.
It's weird.
And now I'm not going to open it for fear of causing further damage. So if there's a question, feel free to shout it out at me, Crystal.
I will, yeah. So, well, it's smaller now, so maybe it won't cover as much text. We'll make the best of it and we'll move forward.
Great. All right. So gender identity versus sexual orientation. Gender identity is your own personal, internal sense of gender. It's who you are, how you see yourself. And gender expression is the way you show that gender to the world. I love this little chart here from GLSEN, just showing all these different terms that get thrown around and really how they play out, right? So your gender identity, how you see yourself, gender expression, how you communicate that to the world. That can just be the way you dress, the way you behave and interact with folks, the pronouns you use, your name, transitioning, all of those types of things. And sexual orientation is a completely separate category that just has to do with your attraction, who you're attracted to or not attracted to. And that can be a romantic attraction or a physical or an emotional attraction, all different kinds of categories. But I think a lot of times people maybe think that if you're transgender, then you're automatically gay, right? But they're two separate things, gender identity and sexual orientation. And another handy little tool for kind of showing these differences is the genderbread person, just showing that difference in sex and where that comes from, and gender expression, all those little bits on the outside that you use to communicate with the world, your identity, all of those things. So this is a handy little tool to use. So gender identity is who you are, sexual orientation, who you're attracted to, which is why being trans doesn't automatically make somebody gay. And that's why we have all the different letters in the LGBTQ acronym, right? Because you can be more than one of the letters in this acronym. You can occupy more than one space on here. And that's like totally normal. And we have these different labels, and there's plenty more that I don't even have listed here. Some folks, especially in research settings, will use the term sexual and gender minorities, or SGM, as an acronym instead of this LGBTQ+. It's a little bit easier to say. And then other folks, especially within this community, will just refer to it as the queer community. So a note about queer really quickly. This is another umbrella term. For sexual and gender minorities who are not straight or are not cisgender or both, queer can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and some folks within the LGBTQ community still prefer not to use this term due to its history. It's used as a slur, and that's totally cool. Totally fine if people are not comfortable with using this term. It's been used to hurt a lot of people. And there are a lot of reasons why somebody might use queer instead of a more specific identity label like gay or bisexual or trans. For some, especially Black LGBTQ folks, they might prefer queer over a label like gay because of a history of racism experienced within the LGBTQ plus community, which tends to be dominated by cisgender, gay, white male voices. If you look at lots of resource centers for LGBTQ folks, historically started by gay white men who are cisgender, and a lot of services cater to that population. And so there's just a history of racism within the community that might make people not love some of the labels that are used by the community. Other people might identify as queer just because there's not really another label that fits them super well. This is actually the label that I prefer to use. Just feel like all the options out there, none of them really feel quite right. You might use queer. For other folks, it's really empowering to reclaim this term that's been used to hurt folks, to use it in a different way, to find community in it. And often it gets used almost as much of an identity label as like a political statement as well, for kind of like radical leftist ideology. So it can kind of be a political alignment as well. But there's lots of reasons, right? This is another one of those terms that really only folks within the community should use because of its history as a slur, right? If you're not within this community, it's probably not appropriate to use the term queer. All right, so that kind of wraps up our 101 vocabulary. We're going to move into maybe some more niche terms. So we have AMAB and AFAB. These stand for assigned male at birth or assigned female at birth, which, like we talked about, just means that, you know, baby has a penis, we say you're a boy, you are assigned male at birth. And we use AMAB and AFAB instead of saying that someone is biologically male or biologically female or they were born a boy. We say that they were assigned this at birth. Another thing you may see used are these F to M or M to F acronyms. These are also kind of outdated, that should only be used by folks within the trans community. Most of the folks that I see that will use these terms are generally older folks of the trans community, just because that was kind of the only label available to folks at some point. And so that's one that they find community and support and affirmation in, and that's totally cool, but most young folks don't use it at this point. It kind of just feeds into that narrative that I used to be one thing and I'm changing to become another thing, instead of just that, you know, if I'm a trans man, that I am a man and I've always been a man, and it just is unfortunate that the whole world hasn't seen it that way. It's really more the way we view those things. And these labels can be really helpful in finding community and shared experiences where you might have a transgender man and a non-binary person and a cisgender woman, and they're all assigned female at birth. So there might be shared experiences there of being an AFAB person, of having your first period, or just experiencing things that are almost staples of like a female existence in a misogynistic and patriarchal world, right? So those shared experiences based on that sex that you were assigned at birth, even if that's not your identity. So language here. I'm going to get into a few more terms where maybe we use one term instead of the other and why we don't use terms anymore. Got a handy little chart for you all. Transgenders or a transgender are terms that we don't use if you're talking about a group of transgender people or talking about a person who is transgender. We would not call that person a transgender. We'd call that person a transgender person. And we wouldn't say, oh, look at all those transgenders. We would say, look at those transgender people, right? Just one way of giving a little bit of humanity to folks. We also don't say transgendered, like it's like a verb, like it's something that happens to somebody. Transgender is an adjective, like, you know, cheesy or hairy or cute or salty. I think I might be hungry. So yeah, we don't say transgendered, we say transgender. So a person is not transgendered, a person is transgender. Sex change, pre-op, post-op, all those conversations around surgeries that people get into when talking about trans bodies, we don't really use that terminology. First off, because talking about those surgeries that a person may or may not choose to undergo is really, really personal. Those things are generally none of our business unless somebody brings that up to us first. Bringing that up to a trans person and questioning them about those things when you have not been invited into that conversation is absolutely sexual harassment. It's really personal conversations about people's genitals, so that's very much private information. So if there's any conversation that you're having about a trans person and changes that they might be undergoing, we just use the term transition instead. And that is another umbrella term we'll talk about in a second that can encompass all kinds of changes, whether those are surgical changes or just social changes. We talked about AMAB and AFAB already. And then transgenderism, this is something that I've heard get thrown around, talking about like this new movement of transgenderism in society, as if being transgender is like a fad or, I don't know, a condition. It's really just more appropriate to talk about people being transgender, or referring to the group as the transgender community, not the transgenderism. Okay, more vocab. So transitioning, like we said, it's another kind of catch-all term. It's just that process of changing your gender expression, which is that outward expression of your gender, to match your gender identity, that internal perception of your gender. And this is not a one-size-fits-all process. People transition in all kinds of different ways, and it's different for everybody. Passing. This is one of those terms that really is most appropriately used by folks within the trans community, or as part of a conversation where this has been introduced by the trans person if you're cis, right? If you've been invited into this conversation, absolutely. But really, passing is about being able to pass for your gender without being recognized as trans. So if you're a transgender man, being able to operate out in society, being viewed as a man, no one knows that you're trans or thinks that you're trans, you pass for a man. And this is a little bit problematic, which is why I say it should only be used by folks within the community, because it gives agency to the observer rather than the individual, right? So self-determination is not a thing here. It's all about how other people perceive you, and if according to other people you pass as your gender. Passing isn't a positive experience for everybody. It can be invalidating. It can feel like an erasure of your identity. It also implies that you're passing as something you're not. So if I'm a trans man and I pass as a man out in the world, right, that kind of implies that I'm not a man, that I'm just pretending to be one and passing as such, which plays into these really harmful stereotypes of trans people as deceptive, which we see in media a lot, unfortunately, perpetuating this this idea of trans people being a trap or lying or tricking people. We see this a lot in TV shows. If there are any fans of the X-Files out there, you may remember an episode where the kind of like monster thing that we're investigating is the shapeshifter, whose kind of natural appearance is that of a man but can shapeshift to look as a woman to trick these people into situations where then they get murdered, right? J.K. Rowling just published another novel where the villain is a serial killer who is a man who puts on a dress and pretends to be a woman to trick women and murder them. So it's this narrative of men in dresses that are, there as predators preying on people, which is just a really, really damaging stereotype for trans women out there, and plays into all of these really hurtful misconceptions of trans people using these, different laws or policies that are meant to be inclusive as a means for hurting people, which there's just no evidence of that happening. So anyway, passing is kind of a complicated concept with all kinds of little strings attached. Stealth is related to passing. This is a term that lots of transgender youth will use. Someone who passes as their gender identity and maybe has been out as, or has expressed their gender identity from a young age and has always existed in their school environment as their correct gender identity. They might have other students that don't even know that they're trans, right? They've always known that student as the gender that they present as, and that can be safer for youth. They'll kind of phrase it as being stealth in their schools. It's just safer for them because of the harassment and discrimination and violence that often comes with being an out trans person, especially in schools. All kinds of ways that students and teachers alike can be really awful to trans kids. So being stealth can just be kind of a way of blending in a little bit, and it can be preferable for some students, but like I said, passing sometimes feels like an invalidation or an erasure for some people. So it's not like a goal that everybody is aspiring to. Everybody is different. A dead name is the name that you were given when you were born, usually. If you're a trans person who has changed their name as a part of the transition, that dead name is the name that you no longer use. Using somebody's dead name can be really triggering and traumatizing. It can cause gender dysphoria. It's something that you should not do on purpose. You should not use somebody's dead name when you know the name that they would rather be called. It can just bring up a lot of deep, deep feelings of hurt and anxiety and fear and panic, just because it's like this reminder that it's a reminder of your identity and your marginalization and this expectation that other people have for you. So dysphoria, like I said, using somebody's dead name can cause dysphoria. Gender dysphoria has had kind of a complicated clinical history. Dysphoria is just clinically significant distress caused by an incongruence between the sex you were assigned at birth and your actual gender identity. This used to be categorized as gender identity disorder. So it was like a formal diagnosis in the DSM. This has now been changed to just like gender dysphoria or gender identity stress, which helps to destigmatize being trans as like a mental illness, which is how it was previously interpreted or understood, that being trans is it's a disorder, it's an illness. So this helps to remove that stigma. There's a little bit of controversy around this though, just because sometimes a medical diagnosis is what was required for trans folks to access medical care that they need to transition. So it's just kind of a way of gatekeeping people from the care that they need to live their authentic selves. So sometimes a diagnosis is helpful, but overall it just further stigmatizes the community as being mentally ill, but it's complicated. There is some in-group debate about gender dysphoria, about whether you have to experience dysphoria to be considered trans. So that dysphoria, like we said, it's just that feeling of what I was assigned at birth is not who I am. And you can experience different levels, different like severity of gender dysphoria. It's different for all people, but there is this debate because there are folks who say that, you know, I'm trans, but I don't really experience significant gender dysphoria. So there's this little debate that we'll get into. And this is something that pops up if you're working with groups of trans youth a lot, because this is a really like kind of heated debate that in our support group, we probably deal with like once a month. So trenders or trans trenders, this is a term that will be used to refer to a person who identifies as trans because they think it's cool, right? It's trendy. I will say that there's not a ton of evidence that these people actually exist. This is definitely a very small minority. This is an anomaly if it happens, of people that say they're trans because it's trendy and cool. I think that the just horrifying rates of harassment, discrimination, and violence that trans people experience make it pretty clear that this is not a fun, trendy, cool thing to do, but this exists. So if you have a trans person that says they don't really experience significant dysphoria, some folks within the trans community will kind of derogatorily label that person as a trender or a trans trender, saying, well, you don't experience dysphoria, you're not a real trans person, you're just doing this to fit in with other trans people. The opposite of a transgender are true scum or trans medicalists. These are both kind of the same term that are also used within this community. These are the people that say you have to have dysphoria to be trans, right? This is kind of the people who use that term transgender or trender. So saying that it really plays into lots of really rigid traditional stereotypes. So if I am a trans man and I don't really dress super masculine and I you know, might still wear makeup sometimes or things like that. If I'm not buying into every single masculine stereotype, then I must not really be a man, right? So the true scum trans medicalist position can sometimes force people further into these boxes that we know are like the root of so many of the problems that we deal with in the fields of sexual and domestic violence. So that's kind of some in-group debate that we deal with. Overall, dysphoria is super different. It can be as minor as, you know, using she, hers pronouns for me is super wrong and I don't like it. It can be kind of that lower level experience of dysphoria, or it can be that higher level of dysphoria of not even wanting to see your body in the mirror because it doesn't look like what you feel like on the inside, right? So there's different levels. Everybody's different. And especially in working with trans youth in general, you want people to feel free to express their identity in whatever way makes sense for them without gatekeeping or questioning or interrogating or demanding that somebody meet some ridiculous set of criteria. This is actually something that some of my youth have experienced in trying to access hormone treatment or puberty blockers, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. But basically meeting with a psychiatrist. One of my kids didn't meet all of their criteria for being trans, and so they were denied this medical care that would be life-saving for them, that would really reduce a lot of dysphoria, but they just didn't check all the boxes. So it's another way we kind of keep people from services that are life-saving for them. Misgendering is referring to someone in a way that doesn't correctly reflect their gender identity. So if I were to call a trans woman he, right, that is misgendering that person. This is an act of violence. This is another way of triggering someone's dysphoria, triggering all kinds of scary feelings in relationships. This is an abusive tactic that will be used by an abusive partner to misgender somebody on purpose, to make them feel small, to make them feel bad about themselves. This is something that pops up in LGBTQ youth relationships a lot when one of the partners is trans. It's an abusive tactic that'll get used that's, you know, specific to the trans community. It is super, super abusive to do this. If you misgender someone, and I guess to back up, super abusive to do this on purpose. People make mistakes, and that's okay, and that's what we're going to talk about next. So if you misgender someone, we've got 3 super easy steps. Number 1 is apologize, but don't make it like a big deal. It's not about you, not about your feelings. This doesn't need to be now a situation where this trans person that you have misgendered now has to console you because you just feel so bad about what you did. Great that you have that empathy and remorse for the mistake, but this is just it creates a lot of emotional labor on that person who has already experienced this act of you know, like microaggression of being misgendered. So just apologize and move on. So, you know, if you incorrectly use she pronouns for someone in this little scenario down here of, you know, the other day she, and then someone corrects you saying they use they pronouns, just roll with it. Oh, okay, like they, the other day they, and move on. So it doesn't have to be a big deal. Nobody wants it to be a big deal. Number 2, thank this person. If they were brave enough to correct you when you misgendered them, let them know that you appreciate that. Reminding people of your gender identity can be dangerous. It's scary, it's exhausting, it's a lot to do, and it literally puts people's lives at risk. So if somebody has the courage to correct you, we should absolutely treat that as an honor, that they felt safe enough with you to make that correction. And 3, do better next time, right? Just make that conscious effort to get people's pronouns right. Practice it if you have to. It is just as important to use people's correct pronouns when they can hear you as when they can't hear you. If they're not around, you should still use the pronouns they have asked you to use. So if you're, you know, working in an agency setting or a clinical setting and talking to your coworkers about a trans client that you're working with, you should still be using the pronouns that they have asked you to use. That is some human dignity respect right there. So a little bit more on pronouns since we've kind of broached that subject. This is just the words we use to refer to people, right? So she or he or they, that's what pronouns are on a basic level. So he, him, and his are the pronouns that are most often used by men. So that's cisgender men, transgender men, men in general. She, her, and hers are the pronouns that are most often used by women. And they, them, and theirs are the pronouns most often used by people that don't identify as men or women. And there's actually tons of other gender-neutral pronouns out there, but we're just going to stick to they, them, and theirs for now, because the others, you'll have to watch some like YouTube videos to learn how to pronounce them. Some have actually been around though since like the 1930s. One of them is called thon, and it's really interesting. It was proposed in the 30s as a gender-neutral pronoun and just fell out of use. So anyway, some of my youth use that pronoun thon. But also not all non-binary people want to use gender-neutral pronouns. I am one of those people. There's all kinds of reasons. Maybe just, you know, you've lived most of your life being called a gendered pronoun and it's just, you know, what you're used to and feel comfortable with or whatever. There's all kinds of reasons and everybody is different. And really you just have to ask, you just have to find out what people are comfortable with. I included this in here. This was a tweet that one of my youth sent me. saying that cis people will say he goes by they, them pronouns. This is something my sister actually did. If any of you are familiar with the singer Sam Smith, Sam Smith came out as non-binary probably a year or two ago and said that they use they, them pronouns. And so my sister said, like, oh, did you hear about Sam Smith? He uses they, them pronouns. So the correct way of saying that is they use they, them pronouns. Gotta practice. And I know it's hard, especially when you've known somebody before they come out and transition, but you just have to practice and be kind of conscious about it. Using they pronouns, I know sometimes people kind of freak out about using they, them, saying like, but oh my God, that's plural. How can I refer to an individual as a plural pronoun? And we get really freaked out, but you already do it all the time. If you're walking down the street and you see a phone on the sidewalk, you pick it up and turn to your friend and say, hey, somebody lost their phone. You just referred to an individual person using a plural pronoun. So using they as a singular pronoun, we've been doing it forever, basically. So it just, once again, requires some conscious effort on your part.
We have a question, Vanessa.
Yeah,
Alma says, have you found any particular trends with Spanish-speaking youth about which pronouns they prefer?
Ooh, yeah, that's an interesting question. Not something that I've really consciously thought about, but now just thinking about the transgender Hispanic youth that I've worked with, if they're non-binary or use non-binary gender-neutral pronouns, I'll hear ze, zay, zem as their pronouns. So either usually spelled like XE, so like Z or Zay, they pronounce it differently. All the kids do. That's one I think that's popped up if they don't use they, them. Yeah, that's probably the only trend that I've seen just from the youth that I've worked with. Don't know if there's a follow-up. All good there?
All good there.
Great. All right, so stating your pronouns, yes, even you, whoever you are. A lot of cis people sometimes feel weird about sharing your pronouns. You're not sure if it's like appropriate for you to do that. It 100% is appropriate. You should absolutely do it. Here's all your reasons why, right? When trans people share their pronouns, just so that they can, be called the correct term and in a way that affirms their identity, that's a dangerous thing for them to do. When trans people share their pronouns, this could out them to a person that isn't actually safe. So every time they share their pronouns, it's kind of that flashing neon sign saying, look at me, I'm a trans person, to all the transphobes out in the world, right? So if everybody, even not trans people, normalized sharing their pronouns all the time, it wouldn't be this flashing neon sign outing trans people when they share their pronouns. So everybody doing it all the time helps to make trans people safer. This is a practice that should be normalized. And there are all kinds of situations where it is appropriate and helpful and necessary to share your pronouns. It can just be meeting someone new. It can be in your email signature, your social media profiles, your name on a Zoom call, the first day of class or the start of a session, like for our discussion group that we hold weekly. Most of the kids know each other and have known each other for a long time, but sometimes as people are exploring their gender identity, they might try out different pronouns. So even though they all know each other every single week, we all introduce our pronouns every time. And it's just a way of acknowledging that we're all learning and exploring and growing and changing, and that's okay. You can put your pronouns on your resume, on your dating profile, on a name tag at a conference. Anywhere you put your name, put your pronouns. I think they just go hand in hand. And it automatically kind of communicates then to trans folks or other gender expansive folks that you might be a safe person for them if you're making that effort to normalize sharing pronouns. It's a little subtle way of saying that I'm safe. So sharing pronouns, right? If this becomes the norm, it makes doing so safer for trans people. It is just the easiest, cheapest way to make the world safer for everyone. Even if you maybe don't really understand what it means to be trans, if you don't like agree with trans people, whatever that means, whatever it is, it affects you in no way to share your pronouns, but it positively affects the trans community, right? So it's of no inconvenience and it makes the world safer. It's a win-win. When it comes to asking for pronouns, I think a lot of people get really, really nervous about doing this in a way that is like offensive or hurtful or insensitive. In general, the more thought and anxiety and panic you're putting into this, the weirder you're going to make that experience. So it's only weird if you make it weird. That's what I tell people, just ask, right? So you're introducing yourself, say, hi, I'm Vanessa, I use she, hers pronouns. What are your pronouns, right? Super, super simple. Almost nobody is going to be angry with you for asking for pronouns, at least within the trans community. Other folks not in the community that might not understand what it is to be trans, I don't know, maybe get their feelings hurt. But within the trans community, almost not like 100% of the time, people are just going to be grateful that you made the effort. And if somebody does get mad, it's not about you. Most likely, just if you ask for pronouns in a super simple, straightforward, respectful way, somebody gets mad, it's not about you. I think working in the anti-violence fields, we know that sometimes working with clients who have experienced trauma, they might take some anger out on you. That's not about you at all, but you know, you're just there and you can't take it personally, and it can be the same with asking for pronouns. Okay, so transitioning, I mentioned that we would dive deeper into this. So transitioning is just that process of making your kind of outward gender expression reflect your internal gender identity. So this can include hormone treatments, surgeries, name change, changing the way you dress, asking to be called by different pronouns, right? But it's different for every single person. People pick and choose what parts of transitioning feel right for them, and it's just everybody's different. So socially transitioning can involve coming out, changing your name and pronouns, changing the way you dress or present yourself to the world. Even those kind of legal transitioning steps of getting your medical or legal documents changed, like getting your new name on your birth certificate or on your driver's license and all of those things, which can just be like a huge pain. And I shared this meme here on the side because this is, I feel like, how every single trans youth I know has come out. So on the bottom here, we have, little Steven Universe reading a book called How to Come Out as Trans. Step 1, make a meme. Step 2, show it to others. I can't tell you how many trans kids I've worked with who come out either just by like aggressively sharing trans memes with their families or by just like sending a text in the middle of the night. And that's the way they feel safest to come out. And like we joke about it, but it really is rooted in that deep discomfort and uncertainty of how people will react when you do come out. And so trying to go about it in this kind of like beating around the bushes way feels safer. Another part of transitioning socially can just be changing your physical appearance. And this is a completely non-surgical method. Binding is the most common thing that trans boys will do just to flatten their chest, to make them appear to be more masculine. Binders are the safest way to do this. Binders, it's that little image there on the far right. That's what a binder looks like. It's kind of like a super sports bra, but it's specifically made for trans boys or non-binary folks who want to flatten their chests. And that's the safest way. Binders can be a little bit expensive, and that's not super accessible for trans youth who are A, youth, and B, maybe don't exist in households where their parents are willing to support them in that way. So a lot of trans youth will resort to using like ACE bandages to flatten their chests, and it's really, really dangerous to do that. That can cause like long-term damage to your ribs and lungs. It's just super, super dangerous. Layering sports bras is a more cost-effective and slightly safer thing to do. So if you're working with AFAB, trans or non-binary kids that want to flatten their chests, and this is a concern of theirs, especially if you are maybe in like a position like a counselor or a mentor that has a more personal connection, you may just inquire to see like, do you have what you need to do this safely? And if that's something that you can provide, if you have like funds for, supplies and things for clients, maybe you are able to purchase binders for your trans teens. I mean, that's something that we do with our youth group. Anybody that needs it, we buy them binders. Just because being able to alleviate that dysphoria even a little bit is life-saving, right? Anything that we can do to make their experience existing in the world easier, we'll absolutely do. With binding, time limits are really important. Like I said, even with a real binder, it's still important to take breaks from wearing it, just because of that impact to your lungs and your ribs. Some kids that we work with experience such intense dysphoria around their chests that they will even shower wearing their binders, and they'll wear a binder for days at a time without removing it. And I mean, they'll end up with bruised ribs. It's just really dangerous. It's best to wear it for, you know, maybe 8-ish hours, 12-ish hours, and then take it off when you go to bed, or maybe when you get home from school that day. It's just really careful to use binders safely. Another kind of way of transitioning in this kind of physical appearance way is tucking and packing. So tucking is this way of like hiding the bulge of the penis and testicles so it's not visible. So if you have a person who's assigned male at birth and they're wanting to appear more feminine, tucking is a method that will be used. There's safe and unsafe ways of doing this. This is actually what drag queens do too. So if any of you are fans of drag or ever watched, you know, like RuPaul's Drag Race or anything like that, or behind the scenes, you're probably familiar with tucking. Packing is the opposite, something to give the appearance of the presence of a penis and testicles. And you can buy packers, that's what they're called, which is why part of the title of this webinar was packers. So you can buy them, they have them specially made. You can also make your own. The youth that we work with, not in pandemic times, will gather together and like crochet packers together. So that's fairly common. And it, of course, results in all kinds of ridiculous conversations when we meet in public together in a group and they're all screaming about their packers and their, you know, penises of like, where's my penis? Has anybody seen it? So yeah, just be prepared for that when working, especially with groups of trans youth together. Transitioning medically, I'm not going to go into this too much because it's an option that really isn't super accessible to most youth, and I'm trying to focus on the teens specifically. But the most common is just HRT, which is just taking estrogen or testosterone injections to present really the way you identify. And I shared this picture here of this woman named Samantha. Her Facebook, if you follow her page, it's Suddenly Samantha. She is a transgender activist, and this is her before and after. This is why people say that this ability to transition and receive this medical care is life-saving. She now is able to present the way that she really feels on the inside. And these kind of before and afters can be such a huge source of like inspiration and hope for trans youth who are stuck presenting in a way that doesn't feel right for them, maybe because their parents won't allow them to transition in, you know, a medical way, or maybe, you know, it hasn't been approved from whatever the medical care provider is, or they just can't afford it, right? All these reasons. So anyway, this kind of serves as some inspiration and hope for them. And there's all kinds of time-lapse, really cool time-lapse videos out there of trans folks sharing their transition journey. The most common kind of medical transition for youth are puberty blockers, which is just a way of delaying those secondary sex characteristics until they are quote unquote old enough to make an informed decision about hormone treatment or surgeries or anything like that. Puberty blockers have like no long-term effects because they're not actually doing anything. They're not changing anything about your biology or your chemistry or anything like that. It's reversible because it's not doing anything, it's just delaying. And so if you have a really young child who has not yet begun puberty that is saying that they're trans, this is a super easy way of delaying the onset of those traits that you would gain through puberty that will cause dysphoria for that child. And if, you know, this was a phase and they were wrong about their gender identity, when they get older, you can take them off puberty blockers and puberty will start right up for them. and it's like totally okay and normal. But I will say for people that do receive some sort of medical or surgical care for transitioning, less than 2% of people regret that or change their minds. That's just not a common experience. And I always think about that 2% number also being the number that we use when talking about the likelihood of false rape accusations, right? And doing like sexual violence work, that false reporting rate is somewhere between like 2 and 4%. And we use that to kind of ease people's fears about being falsely accused. So it should also ease our fears that, kids are making these decisions that they're going to regret later. It's just not likely. Some outdated language that gets used around transitioning or things like sex changes and sex reassignment surgery. It really just plays into that narrative that you're changing who you are to become something new rather than just affirming who you are. So we use gender confirmation surgery. Just there's all types of surgeries that can be done, like so much. Bottom surgery, top surgery. Top surgery is the one that youth really have the option of in some cases. Sometimes they will allow top surgery to be done to trans youth who want to have their breasts removed. But generally that's something that you have to be over 18 for in most cases. And this is not an exhaustive list at all. There's just so many things that can be done. So the moral of this story is that everybody's different. Everybody gets to choose what parts of transitioning feels right for them. And just because someone hasn't ever medically or surgically transitioned doesn't mean that they aren't trans. Surgery is not a requirement to be trans. And some people never want these surgeries. Some people, they don't ever want that. It's not something that everybody wants to have. But transitioning is life-saving. Whatever method somebody wants to go through, it is life-saving. And despite the fact that transitioning does literally zero harm to anyone else, trans people regularly face this violence and harassment and discrimination when they transition and try to live their authentic lives. I know we're starting to run short on time here, so I'm going to skip through some of the stats about different experiences of violence. I will share that 75% of trans youth feel unsafe at school, right? So that's why it's super unsafe for them to be out and why they might prefer to be stealth in their schools. We know we have this huge percentage of trans youth that seriously consider attempting suicide. 29% of trans and non-binary youth have attempted suicide. There's this really great report, if you want to dive deeper into this, from just last year from the Trevor Project on LGBTQ youth mental health outcomes. 2 in 3 of these youth have reported that someone has tried to convince them to change their sexual orientation or gender identity. This is also a huge predictor of the likelihood that a youth attempts suicide. And of course, lots of LGBTQ youth really feel deeply affected by our just political climate and the fact that they see people mocking their identity or even advocating for violence against them on social media and on the news and things like that. That's traumatizing. So in social services, some of those things that we'll see that push people away from services are the refusal to use somebody's correct name and pronouns. So that even applies when they're not around. Like I said, when that person is not around, we should still respect them enough to use the name and pronouns we've been asked to use for them. Asking for a real name when that's not necessary, when you don't need that for any sort of legal purposes. If you really have to have that, ask for their legal name, not their real name. People will ask for preferred pronouns, which kind of implies that your pronouns are a preference, not a requirement or a lived reality. So that one I know is getting really nitpicky, but it's always better to just ask for someone's pronouns rather than their preferred pronouns. Another kind of nitpicky one that you'll especially hear with working with youth is referring to a group of youth as guys, right? Especially for these youth that are assigned male at birth and identify as trans girls, being referred to as guys can really trigger a lot of dysphoria. And lastly, asking questions about their gender identity or their sexual behavior or surgeries or transitioning when it is not in any way relevant to the service being provided. That's really just an invasion of privacy. It makes people feel like they're under a microscope. It kind of pushes people away. So some ways of improving services for trans youth. One, remember that you might not know your client is trans. Maybe they haven't started using different name pronouns or changing their outward expression. That doesn't mean they're not trans. So just know that when you're working with clients, they could be trans and you just have no idea. Protect your trans clients from fellow staff, from other clients. If they're refusing to use the correct name and pronouns for that person needs to be protected. Transphobia is one of the many root causes of violence. So if you allow transphobia to continue in your program, you are enabling violence. So these environments have to be safe. So we have to protect our trans clients. Properly train all staff. Many trans and LGBTQ folks in general don't seek services because they assume that the staff there probably just aren't trained or know how to help them in an affirming way. So make sure people are trained and prepared. And then you have to make it explicitly clear that you do serve trans people and that you respect and affirm their identities. It is not enough to say, well, we serve all people. We have always served people of every race and religion and gender identity and sexual orientation. We serve everyone. That's a cop-out. That's what gets used when you're afraid of making the bold statement of we support trans people. And that's exactly how it's interpreted by the people in that community. When you see something just like, well, we serve everyone, that doesn't really tell me that you serve me specifically. So make it clear. But if you make it clear that you serve trans clients and affirm and respect their identities, make sure that that is actually the case. Make sure that everybody is prepared to offer services to trans clients in the best way and most respectful and affirming way possible. So a few takeaways. This is a lot. I threw like a lot of vocabulary and terms at people. And it's just because these are the things that trans youth are saying, and it really helps to connect with them when you can share in that terminology and that vocabulary with them. But trans kids are just kids at the end of the day. They just want to, force you to watch videos of like K-pop dance compilations, right? Like that's what I do with them. Trans people are people that deserve care and love and affirmation and respect like anyone else, and be open to learning. Part of all of this is just recognizing that we're going to make mistakes sometimes, and that's okay. And we can't get defensive about it. We just have to like own up of like, I'm so glad that you told me that the way I was doing this wasn't very sensitive. I will do better in the future, right? So that's really all we can do. And lastly, I wanted to share some resources with y'all. Lots of different organizations that provides information about the LGBTQ community in general, about that community of youth, and then specifically in these kind of fields of sexual and domestic violence. Like Forge provides tons of really good resources and toolkits on serving survivors and clients who are trans. GLSEN is a great network for learning more about LGBTQ youth, especially in school settings. TINT here is a great organization. The Trevor Project has tons of info on LGBTQ mental health for youth. Resource Center is the Dallas Center up here. That's a wonderful resource if you're in this area. And then I also included this toolkit, and we can drop that in the chat or something or send it out to folks later. But that trans interpersonal violence toolkit comes from Forge as well. So there's tons of resources on there. I'm going to stop screen sharing so that I can see all of your faces and pull up the chat without messing up the screen sharing, and happy to answer any questions folks might have. Okay, trying to see if there's anything in the chat already that I missed. I think Crystal, oh, so wonderful that we provide binders. We try. It's just, it's a like real privilege to be able to do that because it's not cheap. But I'm just so grateful that we're able to do that. Is there any questions from anybody? Anything that didn't make sense? Anything that felt super wrong to you? Feel free to drop it in the chat. I don't know if you're able to unmute yourselves or if Crystal alone has that power.
If anybody wants to interact with Vanessa, if you want to raise your hand and I can give you permission to chat with her.
Slides be available. Yeah, I can share slides with folks. Happy to do that. Yeah, all those charts are super handy. All the difference between like gender identity and expression and sex assigned at birth and attraction. They're just the, I mean, we could probably just skip this entire webinar and just like send people that graphic and it would be super helpful too. Can I access the recording? Crystal?
All right, the recording, pending any technical difficulties, are available on TASA's YouTube channel in about 7 to 10 business days. So, oh, Melanie says, thank you, this was very helpful. I plan to ask my organization to add pronoun sections to all our forms. So do you have any tips or advice on the best practices for that?
Yeah, oof, so much. There are, I guess, Crystal, are we able to like send out some resources to folks at the end of this? Like, do you have like the email list?
Yeah, we have.
I'll just
we can send out a follow-up email and anything you want to send.
Cool. I'll just put together a ton of things to send out. In general, like this is just the best first step your agency can take to providing trans affirming services is asking for pronouns on all your forms. And having everybody fill that out, not just people that you think might be trans, right? It's just a standard thing you have everybody do. And I would say one note is to also include in there like a section of, is it okay for me to use these pronouns outside of this space? So if you're communicating with that person's like family members, or if you coordinate with like law enforcement or their workplace or whatever that is, make sure like, you know, I know that you want to be called by they, them pronouns, but are you comfortable with me referring to you with those pronouns with other folks? Maybe they're not out. So that would be another kind of best practice that I would recommend. Let's see, local law enforcement here had some of this information. Yeah, just yeah. I wish a lot of people had this information. For training staff, who are some of your trusted organizations that you look to? Okay, so you're in Austin, right? Yeah. Resource Center up here in Dallas provides really, really excellent trainings. And now that, you know, coronavirus is our reality, I'm sure they're doing virtual stuff. So if you're not in the Dallas area, I bet they can work with your organization. The Texas Freedom Network is another organization that will sometimes do trainings on these issues. So Texas Freedom Network, Resource Center, that Transgender Education Network of Texas, TENT is the acronym, they do that. Forge, which I also mentioned in the resources, does that. Those are probably, Forge is a national one, but the others are all like Texas resources that do those types of trainings. I'm trying to think if there's anybody else. If you're in the Houston area, work with the Montrose Center. The Montrose Center has people that do those same trainings. I believe Open Arms out in the West Texas, San Angelo?
San Angelo.
San Angelo, yeah.
We actually have some Open Arms staff on the call today, so.
Oh, hi Open Arms. I'm pretty sure they do that too. Any other questions? How youth can come out to their family. Oh, yeah. So Glisten, another one of those resources I mentioned, has some really great guides for coming out, especially if you're a person who works with youth and can kind of support them through that process. Whew. I mean, working in this anti-violence field, we're familiar with safety planning, and take all of that knowledge and all of that skill set into talking, like planning for coming out with the youth that you're working with, or adults that you're working with if they're coming out. Like safety plan with them. Who do we think is going to respond well to this? Who do we maybe have some concerns about? If this doesn't go well, who can you reach out to? If God forbid your parents kick you out, where are you going to go? What's your plan at school for being safe? How are you going to inform your teachers and your administrators? Just take everything that you know about safety planning and apply it to coming out. And if anybody is unfamiliar with safety planning, particularly with youth, loveisrespect.org has a great teen safety planning guide that of course has nothing to do with coming out, but lots of good questions and considerations that you can absolutely apply to this situation. University setting, afraid to do as middle school or high school. Oh, having someone with them, absolutely. I mean, that's what we tell teenagers when they're talking about like breaking up. How do you break up with an abusive partner? Like, do it in a public place. have somebody with you that's safe. All of those things can help keep them safer, absolutely. And really make sure that they have a support network, because maybe if they do this in a public place or with a friend nearby, their family reacts okay while that person is there. And then of course, when they're alone home with that parent is when the abuse starts to happen. So really just safety planning. If this happens, how do we move forward? Trends I'm seeing in terms of DVSV, absolutely. In general, 47% of transgender people have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. And that's for all ages, not youth specifically. And sometimes people ask like, oh, is that why they're trans? No, people are born trans. The violence they experience is because they are trans, right? It's those isms and phobias that cause people to behave violently toward others. LGBTQ youth, trans youth in particular, are at higher risk for like teen dating violence. When it comes to domestic violence, there's some kind of controversy, current event stuff going on with HUD, the Housing and Urban Development, around shelter law or shelter policies about like, can shelters discriminate against trans clients, basically. So that's something that's going on. That's a big need in the kind of DV world for trans clients. Thinking of any other trends with these youth. Oh, a lot of them just have childhood trauma experiences, a lot of childhood like sexual abuse, which is really common for the LGBTQ community in general. And once again, they're not gay or trans because that happened to them. It's just that, you know, these acts of violence get taken out on anybody that doesn't like fit the mold, you know? So that's a really common experience, is just intersecting kind of comorbidities and traumas that these youth have experienced. And one big trend with these youth in unhealthy relationships is that they'll stay in a relationship because our entire society and possibly their parents and teachers are telling them that they're worthless or they're mentally ill or they're a problem or they're attention seeking. So they'll put up with abuse in a relationship because they don't have a lot of self-worth, or they don't believe that anybody else is going to want to be with them anyway. All those kind of tactics that we'll see abusers use to keep people in relationships are just like 116 times more effective for trans youth who are receiving those devaluing messages from all fronts in our society. So that would be the big thing I would say with talking with those youth, is just that like, you deserve healthy relationships, and there are absolutely people out there that won't treat you this way and that will love you, and that you deserve that love, and that you're not a problem or a burden. That's like the biggest thing all my kids deal with.
Any other questions or comments? You have a lot of thank you and great presentations coming through the chat box. They're all throughout.
Oh, there's this Q&A chat. Oh, I didn't even see this. Well, glad this has been helpful. Any advice for driving more trans students to SV services on college campuses? Yeah, like I was saying, people like will just not seek out services assuming that you're not going to be ready for us, right? That you're not going to know how to work with us. So for getting those students, partner with, if you have an LGBTQ office on your college campus, or even like a GSA or a student organization, partner with them. They are the ones who actually know who the trans students are on the campus and will get the word out. Have that department or that office or that student organization train your staff. Even if that means you're getting staff training from like an 18-year-old college freshman, that is ideal, honestly. Yeah, work with those organizations, partner with them. They will get the word out to the people that need it. And advertise, put on all of your like promotional materials, your social media posts, like make it super, super publicly known that you serve this group and that you're prepared, and share, you know, stats about specific issues that affect this community, like in your social media posts or whatever. Just make it to where this is so integrated into your programming that no trans person would ever have to doubt whether or not you're qualified to help them. I just make it like so abundantly clear.
Mm-hmm.
Is using they, them pronouns for everyone a good way to make sure you never misgender someone? Or is this something that could potentially be harmful to some trans folks? Yes, and yes, all of that. If you are so I do prevention education, right? And so if we're in a classroom setting where, I don't know every student's pronouns in this room, and a student makes a comment, I might refer to them as they, like not assuming what their gender is, like, oh, like they said earlier, blah, 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 right? That is an appropriate use of they, them when maybe you're not sure. But if you know somebody's pronouns and it's not they, them, but you use they, them, that's when it becomes a problem, right? You've been informed of the appropriate pronouns to use and you're choosing to use the wrong ones. So that's when it can be harmful to folks. And that's why it's so important just to ask for pronouns, right? So we don't have to make those assumptions. But it's safe in general if you have like a really big group where you couldn't possibly know the pronouns of every single person in the room. For our youth group, we have little name tags that for everything we do, no matter what, everybody puts a name tag on that says their name and their pronouns. Just because, especially with trans youth, their name changes all the time. Like once a month, we got a new name. So it's helpful for us adults to know like, what are we going by right now? Because they're exploring, they're trying to figure out like, what feels right to me? What actually feels like me? So name tags are a great thing to do if you're working with like groups of youth like that. Let's see, is anything else popping up? I don't see any more. Anything else?
I don't see anything else coming in. Give everybody a couple more seconds in case they're typing.
Yep.
Okay, so like Vanessa said, she does have some resources to send out after, so be watching for a follow-up email from us on with any resources that Vanessa's willing to send. Just want to thank everybody again for being with us. This is our last webinar of the month, so a new notification will be sent out about our October series, and we invite you to participate in those as well. And like I said, the recording of this will be available on TASA's YouTube channel in 7 to 10 business days, as long as there's no technical issues. So, and if that's it, we'll stick around for a couple more minutes in case anybody wants to ask a question, but that's it. Thanks. Have a good day.
Thanks all.
A few more people on. All right. Well, thank you, Vanessa. It was great. So we look forward to doing it another time. Maybe in the spring we can have you back. So
That'd be so fun. And hopefully my screen won't put weird little boxes all over the place.
Sometimes it just happens.
Yep.
We got it fixed-ish.
Close enough.
All right. We'll talk to you later. So
Bye.
bye.